This is Garis, masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 549, entitled, How Many Years in Jail for Paternity Fraudsters? Description. This flyer discusses appropriate punishments for paternity fraud. Once the GECs, that's GECs, that's Gender Equality Committees, in the parliaments, have been set up, when the masculist half of these committees turn their attention to prosecuting the massive, decades-lasting gender crimes that women commit against men. Typically, rape gets a sentence of about 10 years. So this flyer suggests that paternity fraud and pill lying, in brackets, both examples of forced fatherhood, close brackets, which are more serious gender crimes than rape, get a sentence of 15 years. Now the flyer itself. How many years in jail for a paternity fraudster? Question mark. By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Masculists are fairly clear on their program, that is, how they want society to be changed, so that it is fairer to men. The first major change is consciousness raising, that is, teaching men how the traditional role of being a man-slave to a woman, working for her for decades of his life in exchange for a bit of sex from her from time to time, is no longer acceptable. Thanks to men, women now have a career window of half a century, so have a powerful moral duty to FIP up, in brackets, FIP, that's FIP, equals financially independent person, close brackets, and not expect to be fluffy crappers, brackets, fluffy equals traditional woman who expects to live off the money and labour of a man, man-slaving him for decades of his life. Fluffy crapper equals a fluffy who studies career incompetent majors at high school and college, that is, fluffy crap, thus dooming her to be a fluffy as an adult, close brackets. Once millions of men, particularly young men, reject being man-slaves to fluffies, then masculists want the second major stage of men's lib to be implemented, and that is the political stage, in which the gender laws are men-fared via the establishment of GECs, that's GECs, Gender Equality Committees, in the parliaments, that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally, which is certainly not the case today. The masculist half of these committees will then push for the legislation of a string of masculist laws that will make the lives of millions, later billions of men a lot more agreeable, due to men being much less abused by the major decades-lasting gender crimes of women against men. 3 of the major gender crimes that women commit against men that last decades of a man's life are manslavery, divorce rape, and forced fathering. A woman manslaves a man when she expects him to work for her for decades of his life, when she is a fluffy who did not bother to become career competent, who simply expects a man to work for her, and that all she has to do to get him to do that is wiggle her twat at him from time to time. The core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being man-slaves to women, against working for women for decades of a man's life. Over a century ago, when there was no contraception and women had a dozen kids. The traditional role of the woman to stay at home raising a tribe of kids and doing household chores, and the man, the husband, was out of the house earning the money for the whole nuclear family, then women had some justification in not bothering to become career competent, to become FIP, as the masculists say, since her role was imposed on her by the realities of getting frequently pregnant and by the time demands of household chores that took all day, especially on the farm. But those days are well and truly over. Today, masculists tell women that it was men who liberated women from those days by giving women science-based medicine, and hence a life expectancy of 85 years. Men gave women the pill, household gadgets, and higher education. Masculists argue that women now have a career window of half a century, even those women who take some years off paid work to stay at home to look after very small children. But those children will soon be off to kindergarten and school, so masculists put enormous moral pressure on women to FIP up and share equally the burden of earning the living with men by bothering to get career competent educations at high school and college, so as to be true FIPs as adults and not be fluffy, man-slaving parasites whom masculists have such a hatred for that we effectively exterminate them by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, so that they rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and totally rejected by men, both socially and sexually, made to feel they are vermin, man-slaving vermin, to be exterminated. Masculists see man-slavery as 1,000 times greater problem than was Negro slavery in the US in the early 1800s. Due to the numbers, there are several billion man-slaves and hence several billion female man-slavers in the world today. Whereas in the slave period of the US, there were several million Negro slaves. Young men are waking up in their millions that they don't have to be man-slaves to women. In the UK, for example, I read that young men now care more about a potential girlfriend's level of fitness than they do about her looks, which shows how strongly these young men care about not being man-slaved by a hated, fluffy, man-slaving parasite. Increasingly, such fluffies are spat at by an ever-growing proportion of young men who have had their masculist and MGTOW consciousnesses raised, who see that vermin fluffies, see what vermin fluffies are, and avoid them like the plague. Thus it is men, masculisted men, who punish women for not fipping up by totally avoiding them, rejecting them, spitting in their faces, making it very clear to them and to society that a woman who does not fip up does not get a man. Thus it is society, and particularly the male sex, who punish women who are fluffies, who are not fips. The second major way that women oppress men for decades of men's lives is divorce rape. The fluffy feminists, in all their deep hypocrisy, have taken over the divorce courts and made them so toxic for divorcing fathers that they have made marriage and paternity toxic for men, to such a point that in many countries now 2/3 of young men reject marriage and paternity, thus making these fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges indirect genociders, since it is they who are the root cause of the crash in the birth rate. Monoconscious, gynocentric feminists will blame men for the crash in the birth rate, since most young men now reject fatherhood. But in reality, they are merely reacting to the toxicity of the divorce courts, in which a divorcing father loses custody of his kids with a 90% probability. He'll lose his house that goes to his ex-wife, so she can raise her kids in it. He'll lose half his stuff and half his wealth to her. He'll be forced to make child payments to his kids, whom he will barely be allowed to see. And if his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life. Thus, divorce today is so toxic for young men that marriage and paternity are toxic for young men. So not surprisingly, 2/3 of young men in many countries now reject being fathers, taking the attitude, quote, "Fuck marriage, fuck paternity. I'm not going to face a 1 chance in 4 of being financially butchered in a hated, fluffy, feminist-controlled divorce court who sees men as cash machines to pay for women to have babies." Masculists see these fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges as hypocrites and genociders. They are hypocrites in the sense that they want equal rights for women in the parliaments, but reject equal obligations with men to share equally the burden with men of earning the living, thus behaving as feminists in the parliaments, but as fluffies in the divorce courts, making them hated by the masculists for their awful hypocrisy. These monoconscious feminist divorce court lawyers and judges usually know nothing about masculist ideas, so by default have traditional expectations of men. That is, they see men as cash machines to pay for women to raise kids. The GEC, Gender Equality Committee, masculist politicians will treat the men faring of the divorce courts with high priority, since 1 father in 4 faces being divorce raped in the hated, fluffy, feminist-controlled divorce court system. This is the end of part 1.